Okay. So hello and welcome to this Australia-UK Housing Network event. My name is Mark Stevens. I'm from the University of Glasgow and I'm a co-chair of the network and will be chairing today's event. The network launched at housing conferences in Adelaide and Sheffield earlier this year. But this is our first meeting that seeks to meet the network's core objectives of promoting knowledge exchange and policy development and to facilitate research collaborations. Planning and house building, the topic that we're discussing today, is a controversial one in both countries. Despite planning systems being organised on different principles, the narrative is strikingly clear. On the one hand, the argument that planning is the principal barrier to house building, on the other, that the economics of the house building industry is itself problematic. Cutting across both sides of the debate is the assumption that housing supply is the answer to affordability. Today, we are fortunate enough to have a strong panel of experts who will help us to unravel these issues. We're going to start with an overview of the Australian and UK planning systems and house building models. Catherine Gilbert from the University of Sydney and co-chair of this network will kick off with an overview of Australian planning. And Bill Randolph of UNSW will do the same for house building. The overview of the British planning and house building systems will be provided by Phil O'Brien of Glasgow University. So over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Mark. So as the first Australian speaker, I also want to just acknowledge that many of us are dialing in today from never ceded land. So I'm actually coming in from unceded Darawal country, and I want to acknowledge and pay respect to elders past and present. So I think you will have noticed I'm not Nicole Gurin, who was unfortunately has had a conflict. But most of what I learned, I'm originally from Canada, and most of what I learned about the Australian planning system, or Australian planning systems, was from her. So we've sort of jointly developed some notes here. I'm going to give you a very high level overview just as context, and then, as Mark said, we'll delve a little bit deeper into some of the nuances of policy in New South Wales a little bit later on. So, as you'll know, Australia has 3 levels of government. So there's the Commonwealth, the state, and the local. And responsibility for planning actually sits with the state and territory governments. So the national level government really has very little involvement in planning and development control beyond matters of national environmental significance. So each state has its own planning legislation that governs the planning system. So there's nuances across all of the different states. But across all of Australia, the majority of responsibility for really detailed land use planning and the majority of sort of development assessment decisions actually sit with the over 500 local governments across the country. Okay. And of course, their plan making and development assessment is guided by, or really dictated by, state legislation and policy. And we'll talk a little bit more in the New South Wales context about how the states increasingly intervened in that in this particular state. So, I mean, Nicole and Christine White have written a paper where they sort of talk about the very common origins of planning in both countries, and particularly with Australia having, the colonial legacy. A lot of the original sort of planning legislation and ideas around, how to plan were actually imported here from the UK. So there's that close historical connection, but they've sort of developed in different ways. And one of the, I guess, key differences when we talk about the Australian planning systems is the principal means of development control. So across Australian jurisdictions, that's land use zoning. So what that means, in contrast to the UK, is that land has implied development rights beyond existing use, which is quite important when we think about, land markets. But also it's about the timing of when land value uplift occurs. So in the Australian context, that's occurring at rezoning, not necessarily at the time of development consent. So zoning rules and other principal development standards governing things like height and density, those are set out in local plans. Now, not all of the rules contained in local plans are purely quantitative. We also have qualitative aspects too that are considered. So while we have a system of zoning, there's an element of merit assessment that comes into the consideration of many proposals. And so we consider things like how consistent is the proposal in terms of area character? What are the likely impacts? So there's sort of this I guess, you know, zoning element, but also overlaid with an element of sort of merit-based assessment. And that's been regarded as increasingly problematic over time, and something that I think Ryan will mention has been sort of pushed back. Okay. Um, so it's important also to understand that while development rights are implied through zoning, they're actually formally conferred once a development application is lodged. It's assessed for compliance with the rules, and a development consent is issued by the applicable consent authority. So who is it that actually decides that? Well, historically, local governments were really the main consent authority for development applications. But that's changing over time depending on the scale of the proposal and where it's located. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Now, the other thing that's interesting to mention is when we think about who decides, right? Historically, development applications in Australia were also, to some extent, determined by elected councillors. And we've really moved away from that over time as well. So in New South Wales, elected councillors are no longer involved in development application decisions. That's delegated to council staff, or increasingly also to sort of panels of professional experts. Okay, so we've seen a real shift away from any sort of elected members being involved in development assessment decisions. Okay. The development assessment process includes opportunities for communities or their elected for communities to object to a proposal, but appeal rights in most states are very limited. So in practice, there's actually limited opportunity for communities or for their elected representatives to actually block development from occurring. And I think that's sort of important to understand, because that's certainly what comes up a lot in the rhetoric. But when you look at actually how development rules are structured in the development process, there's few opportunities in practice for them to do that. So I'm going to leave it there at that high level overview, and I think I'm going to hand over to Bill now to talk a little bit about the house building industry here.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak on this today. I want to just do some things which try and draw out some of the differences between perhaps the UK and the Australian situation with regard to house building, or home building, should we call it, because it involves apartments as well. But there are a couple of things to start off with, just to make it clear that Australia is a different place to the UK. It's a very big place. We have big climatic differences between the south, Tasmania, think Scotland, and the north, Queensland, North Queensland, think the Bahamas. So development kind of reflects to an extent that geography. And a lot of the supply that we have is concentrated in basically 5 major metropolitan areas. So it's very geographically specific, perhaps more so than in the UK. Okay, just to kick off, I think it's worth outlining the land title system we have here. We have 2 main land titles. One is called Torrens title, which is equivalent to UK freehold. But this is a kind of simplified system invented by Sir Robert Torrens in 1850 something or other, 58 I think it is. And it basically, you can transfer title to a piece of land by simply registering the name and the contact details of the owner. We don't have all this business about deeds and transferring packets of deeds around. It's simply, I bought it, paid the money, and you're in. The second form of title is called strata title, which is our apartment title system. came in 1961, sponsored by a major development company, well known to all of us, the person who was CEO of Lend-Lease at the time, who wanted to help the development industry capitalize on apartment development, which was starting to boom a little, but it meant that lenders could lend on the lot within the building. Previously, they didn't want to do that because they couldn't get access. They couldn't get ownership of the block if somebody defaulted. So it really opened up a whole gamut of apartment developments from 1960s onwards, widely copied. It's the basis of common hold, I think, in the UK, although you haven't actually got to grips with that yet, as far as I understand. Leasehold is a very small part of the process here, land ownership, and it's basically with government lands that's sold on for a period for development. Doesn't really happen. Housing supply, just to give some numbers, I suppose, last year to June 2024, nationally 176,000 homes completed. The target the government has set is 240, so I think 240,000. So we've got the same problem you guys have got. Apartments, about 60,000 of that, and development detached homes about 112. So there's a balance between apartments and detached homes. In the middle of the 2010s, apartments, actually, there were more apartments approved than there were detached homes. First time ever in Australia, quite a major change there, but it's fallen back since then. Like you, the supply side has been problematic in recent years. All sorts of factors are playing a part now. Higher construction costs, financing costs have escalated, labour costs have shot up. Community opposition, we're told, is a big problem. I think Catherine has explained the problem with that. But essentially, the supply problem has been assigned to the planning system, as it has in your country. I think recently there's been some work. Peter Phibbs came out with a figure of 50,000 approved apartments in Sydney alone, which have been approved but not started. And I was talking to a journalist yesterday, actually, who'd come up with a figure of 75,000 approved homes in the last 2 or 3 years, which haven't even started being developed yet. So it raises a question about planning, or is it just the market? Okay. Forms of supply, greenfield development, similar to the UK, but this is a process of land subdivision in which blocks of service land are sold to a buyer who then commissions or gets a house built on the land. It tends to be not speculative in the UK sense. The land, the lot gets bought and then the house gets built on it by the owner. That's the sort of structure. It is speculative, but not in the sense that a developer builds a whole lot of property, houses, and sells them off. It dates back to the great suburban ideal of the quarter-acre block. This is the idea of you having a block of land and you put your house on it, a single detached house, and that was your, your castle. Typically, houses are single or 2 stories, increasingly 2 stories, with a garage attached, big rumpus rooms. I think pretty big now. I've forgotten what the average size is. Maybe one of our colleagues from Australia can remind me. Timber and steel frame or brick veneer. This is a timber or steel frame house with a layer of bricks on the outside, not structural, but looks good. And built on a slab of concrete. Okay, that's how houses are built here. And the idea is you have something called a project home builder build your property for you. You get your site, you select the design that you want, and the home gets built for you. Often sold as a land and house package by the developer, but there's a lot of individual choice in that, even if you get a fairly tedious standard output at the end of the day. Secondly, there's a thing which is probably unknown. It wasn't in my day when I was in the UK, of incremental infill and redevelopment going on in our cities. And this is centered around something called knockdown rebuild, which is you buy a single family home on a plot of land in the middle suburb somewhere, you knock it down and you put a big project home or a mansion in its place. And this is very popular in Sydney. Not so sure about the other cities, but I'm sure it happens. It's not speculative because it's led by the landowners themselves. You buy a plot of land and do it yourself. Very popular in Sydney. Knockdown rebuild has been a major way of redeveloping land in those middle and older suburban areas. And there's a thing called secondary dwellings, which is you have a piece of land, you've got a house on it, and you can put a secondary dwelling in the backyard to either rent out or to rent for or give it to your family. They're typically called granny flats as well. But this is largely unmonitored. Nobody really knows quite how much is this going on. And Ryan and I did some work some years ago to try and track this down. It kind of flies under the radar, often under planning regs as affordable housing, but actually not so much. And then thirdly, there's the apartment sector. Much more speculative, built for sale, and dependent in the past on sales to landlord investors. We reckon maybe 60 to 70% of our apartments went into the investment market in the height of the boom in the 2010s. They've got larger and larger. The early ones are 3-story walk-ups. We call them 6-packs or 12 packs, 6 or 12 units in a block of land, which is basically an old single dwelling with enough space to put a set of units on. But though they've got much larger and large, 15 years or so. So we now have big developments of 100 up to 500 units being developed on old industrial sites, old commercial sites. Some renewal of public housing estates, and of course much larger developers moving into that market than there was before. Some of them are overseas developers as well, and that's led to what we call the loss of the missing middle. These were the old 3-story walk-ups in suburban locations, which are actually highly demanded because they're user-friendly, but there's been a move away by developers from that medium density typology.
Bill, could I ask you to draw your comments to
wrap it up? Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I just want to say something about feasibility, because the feasibility, as in the UK, is now fundamental to all development, and it's become fundamental to the planning system as well. And it's based around the scheme viability or feasibility calculation. And the key is to hit that 20% viability target when you assess what you can put on it. And it is actually very profitable if you can get it right. We estimated in an analysis of apartment development in Sydney during the 2010 decade that development surpluses, revenues over costs, was something running at 32%. So that's a pretty profitable sector. And overall, we reckon that $53 billion of profit, that's 26 billion pounds, was made over that period by the apartment sector. So it is profitable, but of course some lose their shirts, others make a mozza, as they say over here. I'll leave it there, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about this as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. So over to Phil.
Hi everyone, I'm Phil O'Brien, the University of Glasgow. So I will try to cover what Catherine and Bill kind of did for the UK. I'll talk a little bit about UK planning systems and how they're distinct, how they're quite particular in international comparison. I think about the UK house building industry and how that's kind of been shaped by planning. And I will, if I keep the time well enough, manage to talk a little bit about where we are now and maybe some sort of new players, where things are going. So the basis of the thinking about the UK, the way it's split, it's not a federal country, but it is split into 4 sort of constituent units. There never has really been a UK-wide planning system because Scots law, Northern Irish law, and English law, which also covered Wales until devolution in 98-99, were always distinct. So after the Act of Union 1707, Scotland kept its own legal system. All kind of UK planning acts were translated into Scots law. Things diverged more in following the devolution to the national parliament, the provincial parliament in Northern Ireland in 1998, 99, and then you begin to get a bit more divergence, but fundamentally these are very similar planning systems. They have the same basis in the kind of two acts of the 40s, so the 1946 New Towns Act and the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. And these were really kind of conceived of to work together, in which the New Towns Act did the big building because it was anticipated that the vast majority of new greenfield housing development would be done by the state, via new towns corporations or via local authorities to a lesser extent. And the Planning Act would then regulate whatever residual development was left to be done by the private sector. And one way of understanding the way that the planning system works then is that it's designed for that particular purpose. It's very, very regulatory. So how does it work then? What does the plan look like? Well, it looks really different from in the rest of the world, really, except for a few exceptions, maybe Ireland to an extent, Malta. Every local authority, the big player, the big planning player in the governance apparatus is very much the kind of the local authority, albeit with really strong direction from central government. The local authority has an indicative plan, so not a zonal plan. So whereas in a lot of countries, so in Germany, for example, you will see an indicative plan suggesting what will happen over the next 10 to 15 years, and then a zonal plan really closely specifying what developers can and cannot do. In the UK systems, the local authority has only an indicative plan. It's got these kind of written generic rules that apply across the local authority space, and then it's got some place-based considerations. So, for example, like Catherine pointed out, how there are quite strict rules in the zonal plan in Australia and local government that will quantify density, for example. So the way that would work in a local authority in the UK is that there'll be some kind of written rules that talk about density. There might be some place-based considerations. So if you went and looked on the Glasgow City Development Plan within Scotland, you'd see some mapping. There's a series of maps, GIS maps, that will show specific areas where, for example, there'll be like a central retail core. They will favour retail proposals within that core. Not that any of these are coming through right now. And there'll be some rules about density there. But really, these are kind of guidelines. If you wanted to apply to do a retail development outside the core, you're welcome to do that. If you want to argue that you can build a slightly denser development than would be allowed in the plan, because I don't know, there's a nearby building that's fairly high, you're perfectly able to argue for that, and you may well be able to do it. So, you can tell at this point then the plan is really, really passive. It's not at all prescriptive, and change is really heavily development led. The plan will have land allocations for where the local authority would like to see new housing, but you're welcome to apply outside of those locations. And arguably then the problems that arise in terms of supply of new housing, which is, as Bill said, is really the massive issue in the UK, as I know it is in Australia, because of that cleavage of the New Towns Act and the Town and Country Planning Act. So we talk a lot about land supply as if planning supplies land. It really doesn't supply land. We have so from that kind of planning and property rights literature, they talk about governance systems for land development or land policy strategies, and we talk about active and passive land policies. We don't really have explicit land policy. We certainly don't have, or we have very little active land policy, and no one's really doing that as a standard. There's not really a mechanism by which local authorities are able to supply land as such. So the way then that development happens is it's really development led. So the local planning authority, which is the local authority, receives what we call planning applications from developers. And the planning authority will then award what we call planning permissions at their own discretion. So within that, then they'll receive the application, they'll assess it against the plan, and they'll also take legal precedent into account. So we talk about material considerations, which are factors established in the courts through common law that will determine whether a development may or may not happen. So things like overlooking, if you build a tall building next to a small house, the tall building will overlook that small house. Well, that doesn't really need to be talked about in the plan because it's already present as a material consideration. So there is no kind of zonal system where building permits are awarded as developments are shown to match the plan, because there isn't a zonal plan. There is therefore then a wide scope for negotiation because the plan is not explicit. And that's been a big focus and big criticism in the context of the numbers narrative, that there is very little certainty for house builders. And crucially, local authority decisions are not entirely binding. The local authority may reject a planning application, and then the applicant, the developer or the landowner can then appeal to a kind of a higher quasi-judicial body. So in England, that's the planning inspectorate, in Scotland, the reporters. And the rate of success is really very high indeed. About a third of appeals are overturned by the planning inspectorate. And a lot of them are overturned on design grounds. So if a local authority accepts the idea of a particular proposal, but would like, I don't know, let's say a higher design standard adornments on the housing, a different layout to make it more permeable, a pedestrian path towards the nearest public transport node, the developer can appeal to the planning inspectorate, say that this, maybe in a viability context. The planning inspectorate has quite a high rate of upholding those appeals. It's quite difficult at times for local authorities to make those final decisions. And as a result, then the local planning authority has comparatively little control over design and layout as compared at least to other kind of European systems, because there's no zonal plan. So the developer determines the layout of the development before submitting that as a planning application. And because of that issue, the inspectorate tends to favour the developer in appeals on design grounds. That's something that might be changing a bit in England because design guidance is becoming a bit more strongly phrased. Thinking about house builders then. So house building is things might be changing a little bit, but house building is very heavily dominated by monofunctional residential developments on greenfield land, against the declining share of those type of developments in other countries like the Netherlands, where that's been really typical for several decades now. We're still doing that in a big way. It's also dominated by a comparatively small number of big builders. So we talk about volume builders as doing more than 2,000 units per annum. And that's become more and more concentrated as well. So the share of the top 10 developers in the mid-70s was about 20% of total completions. By the mid-2000s, that was about 50%. Vertical integration is very normal. So the greatest profit goes to the land bought before planning permission was granted. By getting planning permission is what really adds the margin. So the control of local land markets is really key. We don't have that system that Bill mentioned of kind of land development, subdivision, and sale of plots to families, which happens a lot in Germany. In France, you have a system where there's a separation of different private parties, one doing land development, one doing housing. We don't really have that, although again, if I manage to keep the time, I'll talk a little bit about how that might be happening a bit. There's a big focus on profit margins over volume, because high volume of units really raises your exposure to risk, which again I'll get onto. And therefore the typical kind of product characteristics, so that developers will do the same developments all over the UK, really homogenous, very sort of greenfield focused, very car dependent, for a country relatively intensively developed, very low density. So why that model? It's really, the house builder model is really heavily orientated around reducing risk. Builders operate against the background of a market totally reliant on the preference for owner occupation, and within a really deregulated finance market since the 80s, although mortgage lending was quite considerably tightened after the global financial crisis. And the background to this, as you may well have seen, is that there is a declining share of owner occupation. Especially among those under 35 or 40. Things are changing in a big way, but we'll see how the product changes. And that background of passive land use planning. So you really need to invest well in advance of receiving any profit. And therefore, you're really heavily exposed as a builder to shocks like we saw after the global financial crisis. Buying land ahead of time, crisis hits, or even just an ordinary recession hits, your land loses value. Whatever your growth development value was when you bought the land, it's not that now. And you're left with these assets with declining value. You're also exposed to, like, restrictions in mortgage availability because you've got a kind of a reduction in effective demand there in a separate market. Potentially restricted credit availability, although that's changing a bit after GFC. The big builders tend to bank their profit a bit more, and reduced sales, really restricting your cash flow. And that risk adaptation really heavily hits the product. As I mentioned, you get a really tried and tested product. So a big preference for houses over flats. Although, interestingly enough, in the years rising up to the crisis, we had 2007-8 is the peak year of building flats across the UK, and it's 40%. It's really high by historical standards, and that's absolutely declined now to something like 10 or 12%. Very standardized product used across multiple development, very self-contained schemes, very sort of minimal investment in placemaking. There seems to be a sort of sense that the value leaks away. No sense in investing for the wider community, investing in terms of what you can sort of incorporate into prices. Avoiding sites with big upfront costs like infrastructure and ground conditions if you can. And doing design schemes that you can adjust in order to control your output and costs. So again, this is a big one that you saw after the financial crisis. You also see it just where something like an unexpected infrastructure cost arises. All of those kind of nice adornments on the housing begin to be dropped at that point. So there's a big emphasis on stable markets and returns. And that high risk, of course, means high reward in terms of margins. So where are we now? I think I've got a couple of minutes. The planning system, as I say, the real context has been that the numbers game, the kind of the background of governments repeatedly questioning why the planning system is not delivering enough land. And it's pushed towards an increasing or an interest in kind of introducing zonal instruments. So there's a big flirtation with introducing the fully zonal planning system in 2020 that very, very quickly died a death at the hands of kind of probably conservative MPs in the rural areas around London. But we may well see talk return to that. In terms of the kind of where the private sector is going, two new players. One, land promoters. So land promoters got in on the act in a big way after the global financial crisis. A lot of people made redundant from house builders, a lot of land available on the cheap. Land promoters did a big job of sort of buying up that land, and then as the market improved, so it's sort of 2014, 15, selling it off to house builders. They've begun to diversify a bit and are also beginning to do land developments. Like I said, like in France, this is really common. Land developers going in, buying land, developing out the land, and selling the plots to builders with the permissions attached, so de-risked. Promoters are beginning to do that. I think it's happening a lot more in the hotter markets in the south of England. I've not heard about it happening in Scotland, for example. The other new entrant would be built to rent. So the background to this is, on the one side, on the one hand, mortgages. So until recently, not so much the repayment costs, but the size of the deposit making home ownership unattainable. Now with higher interest rates, even the repayment costs are really pushed out and the reach of many people. And so the private rented sector has grown from its kind of real low point in the beginning of the 90s. It's grown comparatively quite rapidly, first through kind of buy to let, so wealthier older households buying a second or a third house and renting it out. That was since really the late 90s. A lot of that was driven by equity release as well, and for their original mortgage or their original home. Now, really only for the last less than 10 years, you're seeing institutions invest in that. So that's, partly driven by the size of the market, partly just driven by financial institutions really having nowhere else to go. Office market becoming a lot more unstable. A lot of the older office assets just not lettable anymore. Bigger problems altogether for retail. It seems like those residential investments also don't really stack up. Speaking to investors in the sector, talking about really they're having to go with really high rental growth assumptions with those investments. We really kind of have to see where this is headed. We would anticipate more, but a bit like in Australia, I think that the numbers right now are comparatively low, but rising really rapidly.
Phil, can you kind of wind up, please?
Yeah, done.
You're done. Great. Thanks. Thanks very much. Well, thank you, everyone. So now we're going to take a dive into some distinctive planning policies. So reflecting the differences in planning between Australian states and British nations, Catherine will be joined by Ryan van Nieuwelfant of UNSW to discuss policies in New South Wales, and they will be followed by Richard Dunning of the University of Liverpool, who will talk about England. But before they start, I'd like to invite participants to type any questions they have into the chat function, so that will be available for a Q&A session later. So over to Catherine and Ryan.
I think we'll go over to Ryan, okay? Because Ryan's going to talk about some of the reforms we've had in New South Wales, which there have been many, but he's grouped them nicely around some themes. And then I'm going to talk about our attempt at inclusionary housing approaches here in New South Wales at the end. So.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everyone. For some reason, Zoom and UNSW have conspired to reduce me to my barcode, but I am Ryan. Hope you're all well. So, look, yeah, I am going to talk through some recent policy changes, but I want to bundle them up to tell three stories. And the first is really the changes we've seen in process, and that's particularly the centralisation of decision-making that Catherine alluded to earlier, away from our local councils and towards, in our case, it's the state government. The second story is the changes in outcome, and that's this shift towards the intensification of land use within existing urban footprints, what we call infill development, as opposed to greenfield. And the third story really is these changes in narrative, and I only touch on them tangentially, but particularly this is this reduction of planning apparatus to just one single objective, which is to like make it profitable for landowners and for home builders. This omnipresence, and Bill mentioned this as well, this development, feasibility, cutting red tape, streamlining, fast tracking, so on. So I'll talk about some policy reforms that we've had and try and tell the changes in process, outcome, and narrative. So I'll focus on, I will get to some more current policy reforms, but I'm going to start with just a potted history in the three ways that we've really centralized some planning functions with our state government here. The first is the broad strategic policy setting. So it dates back to around 2005 when Sydney got a metropolitan plan. For context, Sydney doesn't have a Greater London Authority or Greater Manchester Authority or sort of the equivalent thereof. But that's because about 80% of New South Wales population is in Sydney. So if we had a Greater Sydney Authority, it would really just be duplicating the state government. So the state government, after a period of not really getting involved in land use policy making, transport's slightly different, but in that sort of land use policy making, which was historically with local councils, we got this City of Cities plan that came out in 2005. And that plan is notable not only for this sort of reintroduction of the state's involvement in strategic land use planning, but it's also significant because it introduced this mantra of 70-30, and that is to say 70% of our urban growth should be within the existing urban footprint and only 30% should be greenfield development. And notably, even that 30% in this 2005 plan, a good chunk of that 30% was land that was already earmarked for urban expansion. So this 2005 plan was really an attempt to put that cloche down on Sydney and contain the sprawl. And we saw in this broad strategic policy things like housing targets for councils, including those inner and middle ring councils that had historically, in the years leading up to 2005, not seen a lot of development or change. Now, this broad strategic land use policy sort of stalled a bit. Trying to translate that into the local plans was politically challenging. I'll post some links as we go. This is that 2005 plan. The state government doesn't host it anymore, but the internet doesn't forget. So I found someone who's hosting that. So if you want to have a look at that 2005 plan, there's a copy of it. But yeah, so basically the translation of this broad strategic policy into the local plan stalled. So the second thing that the state government did was really start getting involved in the plan making. And this, to use like Phil's language before, this is the zonal plan. We call them local environmental plans, zoning ordinances, legislative instruments. Ultimately, this is what tells a landowner what they can and can't do on their land. And so what we saw was the state government basically create a template and insist every local council put their local plan on that template. And the process from about 2005 for the decade that followed that, there was a much heavier hand from the state, because what they were doing is not only making sure that plans were compliant with the format, they were making sure that the plans were compliant in terms of what you could and couldn't do was consistent with the state government's strategic policies. So we saw this much heavier hand from the state in this plan making process. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and we've alluded to it already, that because we do have this zonal system with implied development rights, is that there is a very common pattern where a landowner will buy a farm or buy a factory site, and the zone says you're allowed to have a farm or you're allowed to have a factory, and they will then push to build beyond what you can do under the zonal plan. I'll put another link up for you. This is the standard instrument. This is the template I was talking about. Now, technically in New South Wales, if you want to go beyond what the plan allows, you actually, what you do is you apply to amend the plan to allow what you want to build. And again, historically, this lay with local governments to say, yes or no, we'll make that amendment. But as of around 2014, the state government said, look, if the local council says no, if mum says no, come and ask dad if you can change the plan. And the state government started reviewing and allowing some amendments to these plans to really push for greater development capacity and create those windfalls for the speculative land purchases. And even more recently, in the sort of last, I can say 2 or 3 years, the state government has basically said, actually, don't bother, in some instances, don't bother going to council, just come straight to us and we'll decide whether we'll change those local plans. So like I said, this sort of increasing central oversight of that local plan making process. The other thing that the state government are doing in the plan making process is there has long been this parallel thing where the state government would have its own regulatory apparatus. It's always been there. They're called state environmental planning policies. Don't worry about the jargon, but they sat alongside the local plans. And like I said, they've always been there, but probably in the last decade or so, probably 15 years, the state government has increasingly been using that parallel apparatus to dictate a lot of what you can and can't do on your land. So again, these central policies are increasingly dictating what you can do. In other words, the state government is now taking the lead on plan making for pretty much anything that is going to see significant growth or change, leaving the local councils just to deal with the status quo in the areas that we don't expect much change. So, okay, so they've taken over strategic plan making, they've taken over plan making in that regulatory space. That has some teething problems too. Not all councils are against growth and development, but councils are universally and unsurprisingly against the state government telling them what to do. And so what was happening is that the councils were not approving stuff, even if the state government had said that's now permitted under the local plan. So the third thing, and this really brings us up to today, that the state government is increasingly centralising the development, assessment and approval process. So there's 2 ways I want to talk about and just share with you guys in the UK about how they're doing this. The first is a huge expansion in what we call complying development. It goes by different names in different parts of the world, but this is that sort of codified, as of right, pre-approved development, if you like. And so you don't have to go to the local planning authority to get approval. You just pay a private certifier to confirm that what you want to do is within the parameters of that code that has been pre-approved. And so, like I said, this has long existed. And, again, you sort of mentioned, Phil, that basically, if a developer is subdividing land and whatever, they'll often build their houses as well. So on these estates, you would often see complying development codes for those specific estates. But what we actually saw in 2008 was a statewide housing code that basically said on any parcel of residential land, you can put a house as long as it's in line with this code. By 2009, you could add extensions to existing homes. By 2010, you could demolish an existing home in an established neighborhood and put up a new home. And Bill mentioned this knockdown rebuild phenomenon. And Bill also mentioned that around this same period, around 2009, we actually made granny flats, these sort of second smaller dwellings in your backyard. You could go and put one of them up as well without actually getting approval from the planning authority. So it was, you know, even all the way back in 2010, we're starting to see existing residential areas go under some significant change. But what's really happened, I'll give you another link. I'm just putting these here as a resource for people to come back to later if you're interested. But what's really changed is in about 2020, it sort of started in 2018. By 2020, you can actually now knock down a house in an existing residential neighborhood, and you can replace it with 2 dwellings in a sort of dual occupancy semi-detached arrangement. You could replace that 1 dwelling with 3 dwellings in what we would call sort of townhouse or terrace arrangement. Again, it goes by different names, but if you want to imagine a parcel of land, you got sort of a driveway down one side and a bunch of sort of attached dwellings fronting that driveway. Or you can even knock down your house and put 4 more dwellings up, these sort of 4 6-packs that Bill mentioned. Can't actually do 6 through the codes. But basically, you could replace 1 dwelling with up to 4 dwellings without any planning oversight. Now, needless to say, as a planner, this worries me a little bit. You know, if we see, Bill mentioned this, we did some research on the granny flat phenomenon because they've been around for a decade now, and what we found is they were really spiky. You know, you don't get these things scattered, you know, infrequently across all of your existing urban footprint. You actually see some parts of the city where these things just explode. And so, like I say, you know, since 2020, we would expect in the years to come to see some similar spikiness for these other missing middle typologies, these dual occupancies, these small apartment blocks and whatnot. And that's going to have significant implications, we think, for sewers, roads, even local parks turning into mud wrestling pits. So, you know, we'll watch this space, I suppose. I'll put a link for that for you too. But then the second way that the state government is taking those assessment and approval powers off local councils is through something called state significant development. Now, again, like all these things I've been describing, it's been on the books for a long time. State significant development has its origins as a kind of call-in power for the minister that could basically on like sort of like one-off sort of go, oh, that you know, football stadium's too important for a local council. I'll decide whether you can build that or not. But we saw in the late 2000s, around 2008, 2009, that sort of call-in power of the minister. I mean, I think, I don't know what our libel laws are like, but let's just say that that was getting abused and there was some significant corruption. It actually cost the government an election. But then the government that replaced them in 2011, they didn't get rid of these call-in powers. What they instead did was really standardize them. They would specify types of development and also types of precincts for particular areas that would be declared state significant, and then assessment of any developments in those precincts or of those types of developments. You just bypass local councils, go straight to the state government to decide whether it was approved or not. So in terms of the types of developments, it is things like build to rent. In the last couple of years, to echo what Phil was saying, this is sort of emerging New South Wales, and the state government said if we want to see that happen, we don't trust the local councils. Anything that includes affordable housing above a certain scale, anything that includes seniors housing, data centers, multi-story warehouses, increasing the sort of scope of state significant development has really ballooned in the last 5 or 6 years. But as well as the types of development that the state government will assess and bypass local councils, I mentioned this as precincts. This is the last thing I want to talk about, which is the latest policy reform that we've seen in the last couple of years in New South Wales is a politically re-energized interest in transit-oriented development, for which read, you know, residential towers around train stations. And so, you know, in the case of Sydney, these are not like metro stations or, you know, like tube stations. This is suburban rail, in some cases 60, 70 kilometres from Sydney centre. So these are some fairly far-flung train stations, if I can put it that way, have been flagged for transit-oriented development. We've inherited the North American North American language in terms of this idea of transit-oriented development. And, you know, the current government's single-minded determination is to make development feasible in these state significant transit-oriented development precincts. It's their single, or if not single, certainly their primary means to make development feasible here is to just ratchet up the density and heights and development capacity around these stations. Bill mentioned this, the mantra of development feasibility has become paramount. But it's kind of, I mean, I'm going to say this as, a cynic from my ivory tower, but there's a real naivety, I would say, from the state government here, because there's very little evident recognition that, well, if the developer or a home builder doesn't own that parcel of land, they've just basically increased the price that a home builder is going to have to pay to actually get their hands on it and build on it. So it's not really going to help with their feasibility. It might coax a few of these recalcitrant landowners to sell, but basically that tells you all you need to know, which is that the state government has blinked first and basically handed a proverbial check to these recalcitrant landowners that refused to sell it to developers beforehand. So this is the state of play in New South Wales. State government has no interest in amalgamating sites and buying up land to coordinate and integrate the development on these sites, despite international best practice, despite the fact that this is commonly cited as the biggest barrier to development in these precincts. There's no interest in that. I think probably the most recent thing, literally in the last couple of months, is the state government has reluctantly accepted that they need to do some master planning in these precincts, in these transit-oriented development areas around stations. That's both for urban design reasons, but also in recognition that the sort of local is going to need to be some local infrastructure to accommodate their growth. Previously, a bit like the missing middle, the sort of expectation was existing residents, existing businesses will just share their toys in terms of infrastructure, or at least you're on a train station. So if there's, if you need to, you can get on a train and go somewhere else to find a school or hospital or to walk your dog, apparently. But as I say, there's been this sort of frantic post hoc exercise to sort of master plan these sites and reconcile the infrastructure needs in these transit-oriented developments with the growth that they announced about 18 months ago. So that actually includes affordable housing, which is my cue to segue to Catherine. But I just want to close my rant with that third story that I mentioned, which is the sort of the fact that we've really seen a shift in narrative here. This, centralization of planning power really can potentially, depending on how you want to play it, align with that redistributive role of government, maybe to counter the sort of localism that I know the Tories in the UK sort of tried to talk up for a while. And there's obviously plenty of counter arguments as well around subsidiarity, test better democracy, voting with your feet and whatnot. But here in New South Wales, through governments of all stripes for 20 years, pretty much every reform has been pushed on the grounds of making it easier for home builders. All those links I've been sharing are littered with language about accelerating development, fast-tracking development, streamlining development. Occasionally there's a dog whistle to it, boomers pulling up the ladder on avocado eating millennials and sort of NIMBY narratives, but really by and large is a transparent and explicit policy of private profitability driving urban growth. So on that slightly gloomy note, I will pass to Catherine.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, so obviously we've had just a rapid pace of planning reform here and experimentation in different land use policy settings, largely oriented towards ceding additional development rights, and increasing the zoning, the housing capacity of land through rezoning. But the question is, have we actually been capturing any of that value uplift for affordable housing, given that we have an affordability crisis? So that's an interesting question, another aspect of policy here. And the answer is largely no. So, I mean, in Australia, social housing is about less than 4% of our housing stock. So we've got a very small social housing sector. It's a very minuscule part of new supply, apart from some, economic stimulus in the post-GFC period. We really haven't had a lot of social house building. But unlike a lot of jurisdictions where, over time, over several decades, there was sort of a withdrawal from, public sector provision of affordable housing, we haven't actually compensated for that in any way by using the planning system to deliver social and affordable housing. So in Sydney, we did have a little bit of experimentation with inclusionary zoning. So within a system whereby, zoning is the primary means of development control, one of, I guess, the principal inclusionary housing approaches is when land is upzoned and therefore the land value increases, you capture some of that value uplift at that time, and you actually require the developer as part of the zoning rules to include a proportion of affordable housing. So this is widely utilized in, other cities internationally, where zoning is the main means of development control. In Sydney, we've had a lot of resistance to the utilization of this mechanism for a very long time. So in the 90s and 2000s, there were some very small inclusionary zoning schemes introduced that were highly controversial. Those were geographically very confined to some very specific areas, and the contribution requirements were sort of 2 or 3% of gross floor area paid as a fee in lieu. So by international comparison, this is very minuscule. And until recently, until 2019, the use of mandatory inclusionary zoning by councils was actually illegal. So the vast majority of councils under our state planning legislation and state policy weren't actually allowed to implement mandatory inclusionary zoning. So they weren't allowed to require developers to contribute any affordable housing as part of otherwise market rate schemes. So we now have a situation where there are small inclusionary zoning requirements in our transit-oriented development precincts, but we're talking 2% of gross floor area, 5% of gross floor area. And you can tell from what Ryan said, this is a huge amount of value uplift for landowners, sort of overnight. So we've largely just sort of given away those development rights. And we now allow local governments to implement inclusionary zoning schemes, affordable housing contribution schemes, but take-up's been really slow. So in the 5 years since that was enabled, I think less than half of the councils in Sydney have implemented schemes, and there's a lot of debate and issues around, what the barriers to that are, but a lot of conflict between local governments and state governments in terms of what those schemes look like, how you assess whether those schemes are feasible. I think there's a lot of back and forth happening about that. But instead, what the New South Wales government has tended to favor is incentive-based approaches to trying to incentivize developers to include affordable housing within their projects. And that's largely been through density bonusing. Since 2009, using that mechanism that Ryan mentioned, so the state environmental planning policy, which effectively is a state policy that overrides any contrary policies at the local government level. So using that mechanism in 2009, the state introduced a density bonus that applies statewide. So any infill residential project that includes a proportion of affordable housing, this is what the policy said, would have a scaled density bonus of either 20% or 50% of gross floor area, depending on the the scale of the affordable housing contribution. So the incentive applied to any sites where multifamily housing was permissible. Okay, and it had to be accessible. So it had to be within, I think, 400 meters of a bus stop or 800 meters of a rail station, which in Sydney isn't very difficult. That encapsulated a lot of sites. The affordable housing had to be included in the project, delivered on site, and it only needed to be rented to lower moderate income households at sort of no more than 80% of market rent or 30% of household income. So not really deep affordability requirements. And it also only had to remain affordable for 10 years. And then it would just see back to be market housing. Okay, that was later extended to 15 years. Okay, so how effective has this type of inclusionary housing approach really been? So we did a bit of analysis. Ryan and I, way back, were involved in a Hurry project where we looked at this, and I've sort of updated a bit of that more recently. But over the 12 years that this policy was in place that we sort of looked at, there were around 2,500 affordable rental dwellings approved under this policy across Greater Sydney. So given that we have had such minimal designated affordable housing supply, it's not completely insignificant, but it actually equates to 0.01% of all dwellings that were approved in multi-unit residential projects. Okay, so this density bonus is predominantly being taken up by small scale builder developers. So a lot of our major developers, they're not using it. And I guess when you look at the other mechanisms by which you can get additional density, it's maybe not a mystery why. But also, like what Ryan said in terms of the secondary dwellings, there's a very distinctive geographical pattern to where this is being taken up. And, it's largely not being utilized in the sort of high value parts of the city where we desperately need affordable housing. It's really, being taken up in sort of central Western Sydney. where rents are actually lower, and I guess the gap between what's affordable and what can be delivered under this policy is very minimal. Okay, so what has the government response been to the performance of this policy? Have we changed it? Well, no. So what we've done is increase the scale of the bonus, reduce the amount of affordable housing you need to provide, and we'll see how that goes. So that was recently implemented after a very what there's now called a targeted consultation, whereby only particular stakeholders are invited to comment on the policy. Then that policy change was made. So for a lot of folks who already owned land, it was Christmas morning. We'll see how it sort of peters out after that. But certainly, I think we'll hand over to Richard in a moment, who's also going to talk about Section 106 in the UK context. But I think it's important to recognize that we really haven't utilized the planning system very effectively in New South Wales to deliver designated affordable housing supply, and very much relying on incentive mechanisms, which by their voluntary nature mean that there hasn't necessarily been a lot of utilization. I'll hand over to you now, Richard.
Thanks. Can I just ask what time would you like me to wrap up? I'm just aware that it'd be good to have a Q&A session. I don't want to eat into that too much. So
yes, I'm conscious we're running behind, but this is also fascinating. I was reluctant to cut people off. We haven't had any questions pop up in the chat yet. So I'm taking that as a signal that people are willing to sacrifice questions for to get the speakers. So I think if you can maybe if you could shorten it a bit, under 15, but don't hold back on what's obviously a very important topic.
okay, what I'll do is, if that's all right, I'll probably take out some of the discussion around housing need. And if somebody really wants to know about housing need, that can be the first question. I'd just like to sort of start this with just thanks and sorrow for the life of Tony Crook, who passed away recently. Tony had done an awful lot of work in this area, and was one of the people that was able to speak across diverse audience, was able to hold a conversation with a developer and get information from developers, which many of us struggle to do, and yet also speak to policymakers and engage with organisations. He was a trustee of Shelter. He was a trustee of the Royal Town Planning Institute. So it's a great loss for his parting. Before I do talk about Section 106, I just want to very briefly say that the change in administration to Labour within England has brought with it pretty significant possible changes around planning, but also around the whole operation of local authorities as well. So there's a devolution white paper out at the moment. It's to come out by the end of the year. We don't know what's in that, but that could be the most significant change to housing and planning in the last 50 years, I think, if it really does restructure how local planning authorities operate, because it's the political and housing market and planning nexus that really drives the location of housing delivery within the UK, within England at least. And so playing with that geography and playing with that politics might have pretty profound impacts on how and where housing is delivered in the future. So that's just a footnote. I have no idea what will come out. They've said it'll be out by the end of this year, but it could be pretty significant. Phil's also already pointed out the fact that we've got different planning structures, although based on similar principles across Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's also important to note just that we've got very different politics at play across the different nations. There was no alignment between any of them earlier this year. There's now some alignment between Labour in Wales and Labour in England. But essentially, those political geographies also make pretty big difference to the housing narratives that are at stake across England, and where affordable housing, in particular where Section 106 and similar policies sit within that. So just very briefly, I think you can see a discernible difference in the narratives that are taking place in Scotland, with a focus around affordable housing, in Wales with a focus specifically around social housing, and then England with a focus on housing numbers overall, not necessarily affordable housing. So you can see distinct narratives, I think, occurring in those different places, which is not to say they don't overlap and not to say that they're not equally important, but in terms of the public imagination, they are holding kind of different parts of the narrative, I think. Section 106, just for anyone that doesn't know, this is our inclusionary housing policy, although it's not set up as an inclusionary housing policy. It was a policy that enables the state to ask for things that it wants at the point of granting planning permission. So as Phil's pointed out, we operate with a discretionary planning system. I'll limit this to England, apologies to those in other nations, but focusing on England, we operate within a discretionary planning system, and at that point of essentially transaction of granting planning permission, the state is able to leverage that point in a negotiation and ask the developer or the landowner to provide certain things. Now, they have to be linked to the planning application, so you can't just ask for anything. But later on, 1998, sorry, that was kind of changed slightly to include affordable housing as a component of that to make it acceptable in planning terms. So affordable housing was kind of snuck in through an existing mechanism in order to create an inclusionary housing kind of approach to it. In England, around 44% of all affordable housing provided last year was provided through Section 106. So England has a budget of around £12 billion per annum for affordable housing subsidies, for the delivery of new affordable housing subsidies. So 44% of it's not of that amount, 44% of the housing was delivered through Section 106. So it's a pretty big player actually in terms of the overall numbers of affordable housing that's provided, which sounds like it's quite different to Australia in terms of what's actually coming through in that. The geography of distribution of that is highly, highly variable, and it also is highly variable year on year. So, for example, London in 2023, 2024 had only about 3,000 affordable housing starts, down from 27,000 housing starts, affordable housing starts the previous year. And that was almost all dependent upon Section 106, that reduction not coming through, either because house builders are just not building anymore, or because they've managed to negotiate away some of that affordable housing component. It's important as well to note that a house is not a house is not a house, and the type of affordable housing that's provided through Section 106 is highly variable in different locations. So big differences between social rent, which was the dominant form of Section 106 provision through to about 2011. Then you've got the rise of affordable rent coming in as an intermediary kind of affordable tenure at 80% market rent, but definitely not at social rental values. Affordable home ownership kind of waxed and waned in the early 2000s and is now actually pretty low level, although shared ownership is still there. The point we're at with Section 106 is that inclusionary housing is coming under challenges from a whole host of different angles at the moment across the kind of political spectrum. And it's got a real identity challenge in terms of what it's trying to achieve. Is it a form of land value capture? So is it actually just basically a taxation mechanism where we're trying to get some of that uplift in land value? Is it around spatial equity in housing provision? So are we trying to focus on high price areas where housing associations wouldn't be able to afford housing? Are we talking about inclusive outcomes, so mixed community neighborhoods? Or are we actually just talking about a cross subsidy of housing, so trying to get 40% of our budget paid for by the private sector? And it doesn't really have a clear answer to that. There's no singular narrative where we can point to a Section 106 policy and say it is trying to achieve this purpose for society. As a result of that, the house building developers, through to environmental advocates, through to actually kind of some of the degrowth arguments around economics, are really putting kind of Section 106 under the hammer. So Centre for Cities, a kind of centre-right organisation, is arguing that Section 106 is holding back development. So viability arguments coming into play there. the taxation on development is holding that back. And that's making it less affordable for people in kind of core cities, not necessarily London, but in other cities like Manchester, predominantly. The way that the housing is delivered through Section 106 is that the developer builds the housing, and then it basically goes out to a kind of free market tender for housing associations to purchase that. It's come under criticism from housing associations for not providing high quality homes and not providing the kind of mix of homes that housing associations actually want. And so there are instances where homes are not being sold, so they're not finding their way into the affordable housing tenure because housing associations don't essentially want to pick up those homes. So it's not necessarily providing what we want from a kind of social justice perspective, I guess. The reliance on private development to meet affordable housing requirements is always going to be skewed. There's no alignment necessarily between social goods and market provision. And so relying on market provision to meet social needs is always going to rely on some sort of complexity in signals here. The degrowth argument, I think, is quite interesting and seems to be gaining traction with housing associations as well as other organisations. So Anna Pagani she just moved to King's College London, is doing quite a bit of work on this. And some housing associations are now essentially saying we need to stop development. We need to put a moratorium on all development and focus on the housing stock that we've got. So to be able to invest in quality, bring those standards up to speed, etc. That's part of a wider argument around degrowth and a moratorium on housing development, which is quite interesting. But it's just to say there's a different angle of attack coming in here for Section 106. There's also the argument that as a tax, it's not very efficient because of the cost of negotiation between a discretionary local planning authority and a developer. For every single development, this has to be negotiated and worked through. And there's also the high level of uncertainty for a developer because of that negotiation. So typical arguments that put this up as a cost for development that mean it's inefficient. There is also some evidence to show that the inclusionary component is disproportionately likely to be delivered in low-income neighbourhoods. So it's not actually working best in high-income neighbourhoods where we'd be trying to target things like mixed community housing. So depending on the argument that we're trying to put forward for Section 106, there are some challenges to it. And there's also just the trade-off between affordable housing and environmentally high quality provision of housing as well as just a kind of bit of maths in terms of development viability there. We did toy with the idea of a tax, of the infrastructure levy. I'm not going to go into that, but that essentially has been parked. That would be a variable geographic tax levied by local authorities. It would have kept Section 106 going as a kind of small part of it, but that's been removed partly because of the complexities of local authorities being able to adequately tax development in a way that continues development proportionally in a representative way. I think I'll stop there. That's all right. Happy to chat.
Okay, thank you very much, speakers. I'm very conscious that we've run over time. There haven't been any questions posted in the chat. Does anyone have an urgent question or two? Okay, if not, then I think we're pretty. Oh, we have one from Andrew Clark. Hi, Andrew.
Hi all. Thanks for some interesting presentations. I was interested, Bill, you got this thought going in my head when you talked about the research you'd done on development profitability in the 2010s. And then we've heard a lot about arguments or a focus, narratives around viability and trying to make, that's a kind of key policy aim. And a lot of those, I'm sort of approaching this just from kind of reading the news without any kind of, systematic analysis, but a lot of that seems to be linked to post-pandemic cost increases in, you know, in Australia in particular. I mean, I don't know about the UK, if this is the same about the cost of labor, you know, has been a big thing, you know, not so much now, but also supply chain issues and all of that kind of stuff. Is there any evidence that the profitability of developing homes has decreased in the post-pandemic period? Does anyone know in either context?
Do you want me to kick off the discussion there? Look, yeah, a really good question. Of course, if you ask a developer, they'll say yes, you can't build anything anywhere because of these cost imposts, and oh, by the way, we want the planning system out of the way anyway. Look, I think there's obviously some problems with the development sector at the moment with those costs, which have skyrocketed in some areas, but they are starting to come down now. So construction costs are starting to fall back in Australia. Finance obviously is a problem with interest rates having gone up so much. But again, the prospect there is that they may well be on the way down. So I think and labour shortages, we've got calls for from the development sector to open up immigration to skilled trades and get them back, because a lot of them left during the pandemic. So I think there's a case for making that that development has been problematic, and the fact that, as I said, I think during my thing, that there are thousands of approved homes waiting to go, but nobody willing to put a brick on top of the other for whatever reason. Finance is a big problem. Anything vaguely risky, and this is a risky area, as we know, the finance is not forthcoming. So, and I think the punters have backed off, actually, particularly in apartments. You know, the defect scandals we've had here in Sydney and Melbourne have really put people off. And there's now management problems. You know, the whole kind of getting involved in you know, as a unit owner in a block of flats, you're part of the owners corporation. You have onerous responsibilities, and you can be really stuffed if stuff goes wrong. So I think the kind of gloss has come off of that market, and I think developers are having a hard time putting case to financiers to get it going again. However, is it profitable? I think it has to be profitable because people are still in the game. And as we reckoned, there were big profits out there to be made, even during the boom period. So yeah, look, there's not enough work done. I mean, obviously as a researcher, I would bound to say that, but I've just been writing a paper on this, trying to write this stuff up, and there's not a lot of work out there on this. There's some, I'm just trying to think who it is in the UK has done work on this. Name's just gone out of my head, but Steve Rowley in Perth has been looking into this stuff, but there isn't a lot of real hard evidence on this. It's very difficult to get.
I think it's quite interesting too, but like listening to all the speakers, and there's this whole sort of ecosystem of factors affecting feasibility. But in both countries, there's a sort of an attack on the affordable housing contribution as the thing that's the tipping point, you know, and I think it's sort of exposing, you know, where that sits within this broader sort of feasibility, you know, calculation would be interesting as well.
Well, the key thing is to get the data. I mean, it's always the problem. We've been able to stitch up a really interesting data set by getting stuff out of government data sources, you know, land sales, unit sales at the end of the day, development approval costs, those sorts of things, stitching it all together at an address level. But that's time consuming and often pretty fraught, actually. So I think there's a lot of, I don't think councils and planners actually have much of a handle on this. They don't seem to check this stuff out particularly. Some do, some of the bigger ones perhaps, but there's a kind of ignorance about what is really profitable and what isn't. And you know, it's a very opaque area, and people can make claims which are very difficult to counteract.
Well, there's this constant sort of back and forth between it's the developers, it's the councils, and the landowners are sitting there completely scot-free. Like no one's questioning, you know, what's an acceptable land value or profit and tracking that. And so, you know, if you can get that data, I think exposing it is, which I know you've done a bit of work in that area, I think is very valuable.
So no, it's an opportunity for research. Opportunity for research there.
Just put a link in the chat to some work done by Chris Foy and Ed Shepherd for cash around this in the UK. It is quite interesting. One of the problems we've got is the small number of volume house builders, and some of those volume house builders come out and explicitly say, we're not volume house builders, we're profitability house builders. So they're seeking margin rather than volume in terms of making the number of dwellings. So there's a tension there when we're relying for a social good to be provided by the market, and the market is structured in a particular way, and so always only ever going to end up in kind of one result.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've actually seen this one. This is one I was trying to remember. So yeah, there's some work in the UK on this, but very little really comparative analysis.
Mark, I think there's a question from Shah in the chat.
Yes. Yes, so Shah's asking, I'm wondering if there are specific incentive policies for build-to-rent housing in both countries. It would be great if you experts could briefly talk about it. So,
well, sorry, I could say that I don't know a lot about the policy scene in the UK. Yes, so certainly in England, local authorities are asked to be predisposed towards build to rent. There's not a whole lot of policy at national level. Local authorities have their own policies. We've seen certain places where it's really exploded. Like Manchester's really obvious. It's a comparatively fast-growing city. Quite a lot of migration into it. Maybe the big policy issue has probably been in Scotland, where I don't know what it's like in Australia for this, right? Across Europe, you tend to have some kind of rent control regime. In the UK, you did have actually really tight rent caps up until what, 70s, 80s, then you had nothing. Scotland's reintroduced a rent cap following the kind of coming out of COVID, inflation of cost of living crisis. As a result of that rent, so it's quite a harsh sort of, initially it was quite a harsh sort of blunt instrument rent cap. We're now at the point where Scottish government is kind of deciding what to do about that. It drafted a policy that left this really open to local authorities to decide on. We're kind of between that and coming up with a kind of a final policy now. As a result of that, probably not so much the blunt instrument rent cap, but the uncertainty, you're seeing very, very little built to rent in Scotland. So if you compare Glasgow and Manchester, really different images actually, but almost precisely the same output per worker. Glasgow's got lower population growth, but you should, on that, simple basis, you should be seeing a lot more build to rent than you are seeing. And that's largely because they, I think I mentioned earlier on, probably with realistic rental growth projections, no one can build to rent. So there's a degree of hopefulness about this right across the UK. In Scotland, your rental growth projections are inevitably really sort of inhibited by the risk premium that you're having to attach, because you just don't know whether the rent control is going to go. So it might end up that, in 12 months' time, we've got a really realistic rent control policy with something like rent controls within a particular, for a particular household within one period of tenure, but reverts to market rate outside of that, which developers would probably cope with. Or we might have something much more tightly controlled, in which case we might still see that sort of stem in the flow. Yeah, that's probably all I know about it for the UK, I'm afraid.
Does anybody in Australia have up to date? We've just had a bill passed in federal parliament to allow build to rent to happen.
Yeah,
or
so
at least, yeah, go on.
I'll speak to a couple of things. So we do have some planning incentives, and I mentioned the sort of it gets fast tracked, but they also get some other incentives. You can build, normally in a commercial centre where you can't have apartments, you can build to rent. So there's, which is like a little leg up, because normally commercial land's cheaper than residential land. So there's a few planning incentives for build to rent. That's New South Wales. But yeah, Bill just mentioned that federally we've just had a taxation change, and I must admit that it is a little deep in the weeds for me. But basically, there used to be a taxation arrangement where foreign investors had to pay a higher tax rate on housing investment because they were trying to discourage sort of housing being taken away from red-blooded Aussies. But they've sort of changed the taxation to basically just to balance the taxation. So now international, super funds or whatever it might be, Canadian and super funds can now build to rent in Australia, and the tax rate's now the same as other forms of commercial real estate investment in Australia. So it's not so much an incentive, but it's a removal of the disincentive, shall we say. There's some other elements to that as well. They've got to include some affordable housing, but yeah, the sort of the main ones that are happening at the national level is this tax change.
Yeah, that last point is really quite a victory for the affordable housing people, because it's each development's got to provide a minimum of 10% of dwellings available to affordable tenancies for 15 years, for at least 15 years. So that's that's 10%. So whether or not it'll stack up in the FISOs, who knows? But it's a step forward. Yeah. So I think there could. There are some the big players, some of the Mervac and some of the big tier 1 players have been doing this stuff in the last few years. But it's a possibility it'll take off. Interestingly, we've got a federal election coming up, and the Conservative opposition, the Liberal coalition, said they will repeal this act if they ever get in. This is and the general election's coming up in sort of April, we're told. So yeah, interesting times. But for build to rent,
the other thing about build to rent is student accommodation. Actually, I think it's the same in the UK. It was kind of a bit of a beachhead for build to rent, was purpose-built student accommodation, sort of proof of concept for the business model. And so we still see a lot of that, which is interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because I think recently the federal government in the latest budget, it's just encouraged the foreign individual developers to engage in the build to rent sector. I think that might be an interesting potential research area. I'm going to go deeper. So if you have any kind of other references about build to rent housing, and especially if there are any practice in the UK, you have any kind of foreign investment involvement in the build to rent sector, I think it will be very helpful for my future research. I think that will be one particular interest I want to develop more. Thank you.
Okay.
Shah, you can convene a session next year on it, I think.
Fine.
Yeah.
Just try to know this build to rent sector more. And yeah, thanks Ryan and Bill for the general knowledge about that in Australia case. Thanks.
Yeah, Andrew posted it in the chat, but Hal Parsons on top of that federal policy change more than anyone else, I think.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. I think we better wrap up now. So I think that's been an incredibly interesting session. I don't feel embarrassed to say that I learned quite a bit about the UK as well as Australia from your insights. Some of the sort of very, very, very broad things that I took from it is that in planning, understanding the operational planning systems, it's impossible to do so without understanding house builder / developer behaviour. The two are so closely interlinked, and kind of related to that, the question about land value capture and developer contributions and so on. I think this is an area where it's surprising that the economists who see housing as just a demand and supply, it's a simple thing, often have a surprisingly little interest in the actual economics of land markets and the way that interacts with planning. I think it's actually useful to go back to first principles and work out about who owns what in terms of land value, when in any planning system, the starting point is that the state owns development rights. And so I actually think some in principle thinking there it might be a key thing for going forward, and actually comparing the two countries and the way it operates might actually help unravel some of that. And then that might lead to a third thing, which, if we're thinking about proposing how things might change rather than only than understanding what's going on, is, what can the role of the state or government be in planning, in terms of whether it can be more proactive. And my feeling is that the state, I use in a broad sense, very much underestimates what influence that it might have, and that may well be key to gaining housing affordability and quality and so on. Something that I think we're all interested in. And I guess one final point that did come out also is that I think in both countries, the way planning in many ways has been reduced to a numbers game, and those kind of ideas of shaping communities and so on is very much a secondary consideration. And I think as the UK tries to ramp up housing output considerably, then that is going to become a considerable issue here. So I think there's an awful lot of food for thought that's arisen from today's discussion. We'll have a good think about how we can take this forward. So we'll do that and get back to you. So I'd like to thank the speakers, thank everyone who attended at inconvenient times of the day, at both ends of the day. The recording of this will go up on our website, which you can easily find through googling it. And I should extend thanks to Cash for providing the secretariat for the network. Also, if people have ideas for future events that we might hold, then please get in touch. And any feedback on this event, it's the first one we've done, so we'll learn how they play out. But otherwise, thank you very much for attending. If any of the speakers want to hang around for a minute for a quick debrief, please do so. But otherwise, I'll stop recording now and wish you a good evening in Australia and have a good day in the UK. Thank you.